Good morning, everyone. Lovely to be back here. It's very nice not to have to do it on Zoom as I did yesterday, which was a bit of a disaster. So it's lovely to be in with human beings and with a room full of lots of people. Wow. So we're here to talk about what the UK UK needs from a national AI strategy. Earlier this year, the AI Council published its AI roadmap, suggesting 16 ways that or themes that the government should be thinking about. So we're going to be discussing some of those. Alexandra stole some of my thunder in terms of some of the introductions, but just to add that Sir Adrian Smith has just taken over as chairman of the Royal Society. Andy Richardson's apparently codes every day. Something you didn't know about him. So if you have any coding tasks, Andy's your man. And he says his strongest ability is to go from code level discussions to board level ones. So hopefully we'll cover the range of those discussions in this. And Rachel is, I'm just going to flag, is currently working on a book about equality, climate change and automation. So teeing up for her future book. And also started a career as a lexicographer, moving encyclopedias to CD-ROMs. So a long history in the data industry.
That's awesome.
Couldn't let that go. So let's start with the UK AI strategy. And I'm going to start with you, Adrian, and ask everyone this question, which is, if you were writing the AI strategy, what's the one thing that is essential? And I know you're a mathematician and you said you had two things, but I'm not going to allow you to have two things yet.
Okay, so I think the key word is national. It's a national strategy, but in an arena where everybody in the world is interested and is a player. So I think the key thing is the recognition of what are the strengths of the UK that we can build on, where are the competitive advantages? And that will span everything from data to people. And where we don't have natural advantage, then we have to make sure that we're open to global talent and ideas from elsewhere. So national positioning in a competitive international context. And
just to follow up, if you had to say, you've highlighted the idea of what the actual strengths are of the UK, what for you are some of the key strengths that you think we have?
I think if you take something like the NHS, there's unique assets there in terms of data, which won't be there in many parts of the world. And we have great strengths in the basic sciences, the mathematics, the computer science, the statistics, where we are actually world leading.
Great. As a true statistician who talks about the benefits of the UK, so it's great to hear. So over to you.
Yeah, I would say I would actually begin with data, and that really, if we are going to be representing everyone, that data needs to be truly representative of everybody in the country. And that I understand it's very difficult when you're trying to announce things that are exciting and that get everybody G'd up. But that actually, the reality is there's a lot of hard work and a lot of sort of difficult ethical, moral work to be done, which is not particularly sexy, actually. And that actually, I think a really kind of bold opportunity for leadership is thinking about what would an AI strategy look like that genuinely worked for and represented everyone in the country, and that didn't mean we were continually leaping ahead, getting it wrong, being told off, and moving on again.
Great. And Andy?
So I did an English literature degree, so that makes me a kind of a world-class pedant. So what I actually want is a strategy. What I don't want is another wish list. So the recommendations, the 16 recommendations that this will be based on are great, but we already have our wish list. What I want is a strategy. So not in terms of like a football manager strategy where my strategy is to win all the remaining games and avoid relegation. That's a fact. That's how you're going to be successful. So it needs to be actionable. It needs to be an actual strategy. What are you going to do concretely? What are you going to stop doing? It can't just be, we want to be the leading nation in the world when it comes to AI research, talent. We want to have the most secure data sharing arrangements. And there was two phrases in the recommendations where they've got safe innovation, which is a very difficult thing to do, and safe data sharing. So if the strategy just tells us that we're going to be a world leader, of course, every nation wants to be a world leader in everything it tries to do. So what are we tangibly going to do? I really liked almost all of the recommendations, actually, because there was some very good tangible points there. There's, how shall we have a method for turning a strategy into something realistic in the UK? And it's the the Alan Turing Institute. So there's some very good, very specific things in the recommendations there. But then there's we want to improve AI literacy, throughout the population. And that's a very interesting thing to want to try and do in our nation at this time. We have a section of society that publicly claimed, they're sick of experts. So it's going to be a very hard thing to do, is to explain ethics, AI. But what I really want to see in the strategy, a word that was missing, I think, from the recommendations, is the word consent. I want to see how they are going to address the issue of consent on a national level within that strategy.
So currently it's a bit too motherhood and AI apple pie at the moment in terms of the proposals and themes.
They're all laudable goals. They're all things that we should definitely do. I want the strategy to tell me how this is going to work, under what time frame, with what budget, who's going to oversee, who's going to take it forward.
Well, let's talk about budgets again. In the council set out the 16 principles, one of which was, as you say, calling on the government to scale up its investment for a decade and beyond and double down on previous investment. But how much investment is needed? Obviously, we're aware of the context, which is the Germans have spent 3 billion or announced plans to spend 3 billion on the AI strategy. The French government have announced plans to spend 1.5 billion. A single Chinese city, Tianjin, has in 2018 announced plans to spend 16 billion on its AI sort of governance and an AI fund. So, Adrian, I wonder if I could come to you about how much does the money really matter that the UK government needs to commit to show that it's serious?
I don't know how to arrive at a single number, but I think this international comparative thing does teach you something in terms of the importance and focus. I think one of the problems we have, all these aspirations, as Andy said, we have to focus more. So there's another mantra in government in thinking in terms of the UK and its positioning is where do we really own something and are really great at it? Where are we okay but need to collaborate? And where we're not really in the business, so we buy it or rent it. And I think it would be good to subject all the kind of headings here to that kind of scrutiny, and then make your investments and your calls on the basis of that prioritization. I don't know what the number would be, except it'd be a hell of a lot bigger than it is now, and a lot of that should go to the Turing Institute.
Great, you heard it here first, someone. Rachel or Andy, do you have a perspective on how much money is needed?
I mean, I would say that, like, over the years, when I have done any sort of like technical change at an institutional level, and obviously institutions are different to whole countries, but there needs to be a moment when whatever the technology suddenly have a strategy for that is in a box is no longer the thing that has the special strategy, and it's just a part of how everything works. And I would say that there's almost something really limiting about saying we are carving out this amount of money to spend against this thing over this period, because over the next 10 years, the thing that ought to happen is AI is a part of how life is lived, how things are commissioned, how industry works. It isn't like a special thing over here. And I think the longer that we box it off, the more at risk we are of kind of like being in this weird world where we're competing in a thing that isn't really a race, and so I would advocate to be more holistic, I guess.
Andy, do you have a
view
on the money?
Those are both great answers, so I don't have much more to add. But I think that I'm just going to kind of reiterate a couple of points there. So we could go very deep on one thing and try and become the best in the world at that thing. But what's the point? So are we still, at the end of the day, going to be using infrastructure that was created by Google and do machine learning and data science? Do we care about owning bits all the way through the stack? So this is, we have a cloud computing environment in the UK called UK Cloud, because we wanted our own that's not AWS or Azure. Okay, it's got a nice crown logo on, but I'm not exactly sure what it buys us when so much of the rest of our traffic goes through the large American corporation providers. So it's the same thing there. Are we going to invent our own, alternative to TensorFlow and things like that so people can do? How far do we have to own this? And I don't think we have to own a lot of this. I think the money needs to be spent very wisely, and you mentioned like Xinjiang there, which is putting an awful lot of billions, but there was the word fund there, wasn't there? So it's not just going on funding government or centralized projects there. That's also investment capital, and that's what I would like to see in the strategy in terms of money. Maybe match funding for VC or private equity that want to do AI work in the UK. We can make it an incredibly attractive country for corporations to come and do AI work, but that's taxation policy, it's investment policy, it's economic policy. So I think it's how we use the money as well as the kind of pound amount.
But let's touch on, I'll come to you in a moment, on the sort of the economics of this. Alexandra had a great session last week at the Tortoise AI Summit. And we had the founder of SoftBank was speaking. He said in the next 10 years, he's only investing in deep AI companies. And he also predicted in the next 10 years, the biggest companies in the world would all be AI-enabled companies. And he also then predicted that they will all be Chinese or American companies, as they are now. So how much, given that we know the sort of the lie of the land, that it might be a replication of where we are now with very big network effect, dominant US and Chinese technology companies without a seat at the table for a big European company or a big UK company. How much does that landscape matter? And how important is it that the UK national AI strategy helps to create a similar big sort of gorilla on behalf of the UK? Adrian.
Well, it's what you think you can change, alter and direct, and what you have to accept, if you like, as boundary conditions. And one of those boundary conditions might be that we're not going to invent a Google. And we're not going to be able to invest at the rate of America and China in exascale computing. But you see a lot of this stuff, go back to Rachel's implicit point, why are we doing all this? Presumably for the public good, well-being, health, etc. So what are the enablers that enable us to get there? And we have unique kind of things in the UK in terms of data assets. We also have, and it's been the case with the finance industry and the attractive, a kind of safe and integrity space for doing certain kinds of business and the law. There again, we're not the US, we're not China. There's a unique positioning we could find in that space. So look at enablers and talent. People do like, or have in the past, loved coming to the UK to be scientists and postdocs and all the rest of it. We're not doing necessarily everything we could do in that space, but a magnet for global talent and seeing it ultimately in terms of how do you create public good and well-being.
So it doesn't really matter if we don't have a sort of big supranational global champion.
If it mattered totally, and we were all convinced of that, then we would have to do something, invest to change it. Does it matter? I think that we have to have that debate about what do you really need to own and what do you just have to accept as a boundary condition.
Andy?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a very kind of tricky thing, I think, to work out where the boundaries are here, because if we try and compete internationally with other nations that have more relaxed efficacy around how they collect data. So for example, are we always going to lose because our population is smaller? Yeah. So can we ever compete with China or India where populations are over 1 billion, because they will have more data, and more data is better. Data scientists love as much data as possible. So we can't really play to our strengths. We're a small island, and we're relatively dense in terms of population density. So we'll always have a limited data set. So maybe it is we have the most ethically accessed data set. Maybe we have the greatest protections and provisions for members of society around that data. So given we might not have big data, and we've got kind of medium-sized British data, thank you very much, maybe we have to have better quality data, or better collected in terms of how the public actually views these kind of programs. If you're doing data science in a geography that has a lot of capital available for you to do your work, and you can get an awful lot of data, and there's no questions asked of where it's come from, and it's huge in terms of its reach and its scope, because they have a large population and more authoritarian kind of governance around it, then we can't compete, and I would argue we shouldn't compete to try and be just bigger in terms of data. I'd want better data.
Rachel, do you have a view?
I mean, I would really strongly agree with that, and that actually, you know, I think one of the things that's happening here is it's a very kind of quaint idea that like basically, right, something that I'm always really interested in is like, why do men want to launch rockets with so much, right? What is the kind of emblematic importance of that kind of incredibly strident, explosive kind of innovating, when actually it's kind of, you know, who wants to live on Mars anyway, right? It's not, you know, and I suppose what I would say is like the narrative of what we're trying to do maybe is not to be even world leaders in the things that China are leading in. For instance, I think we spent a lot of the last 20 years repenting at leisure that the Silicon Valley values have had such an enormous impact on how life is lived here, and that it's kind of by, I suppose, kind of slotting into the wrong narrative that works in the medium of the press conferences and announceable things. What we're likely to do is not focus on the things that we're great at, which is governance, you know, and so I think actually there's probably a bit of there's a bit of confidence that is needed to say we have a different game, and that to get there, I think there probably needs to be a bit more technical understanding in government.
So if we look at the leading in governance as a sort of concept, we saw the EU and the US today come out with a new body. They had an EU-US summit in Brussels this week, and they just announced a new joint technology competition policy dialogue, which talks about how they're going to convene around tech platforms and data governance and AI policy, and how they can collaborate. And we've also seen the EU come out with their own AI policy, which is trying to be supranational and very confident about, you know, sort of post-GDPR environment for Europe for AI. Where does that leave the UK in terms of its opportunity to be distinctive as a governance body of AI when they don't have a seat at the table? And I'm going to start with you because I know Adrian's answer.
Well, let's not mention the B word there that has placed us into this position where we're both in Europe and on the edge of Europe. So it is very problematic. We find ourselves in a very tricky place here. We either, the choices are very simple. Either we have to be nicer and get on better with Europe and hope to join as a kind of periphery member there, or we do the same to the US. So maybe we can be part of a different coalition, but it's always going to be smaller than Europe and the US put together. There is no bigger kind of coalition in terms of, well, pretty much any metric you can throw at it. So we either have to be nice and swallow our pride and go back to Europe and saying, hey, when it comes to data sharing, when it comes to Five Eyes security at the borders, and when it comes to, you know, other things, we would like to be closer than maybe we have indicated over the last few years. Or we do the same as part of, it's not the special relationship anymore now, it's the oldest surviving alliance or something. It was kind of rechristened, wasn't it, in Cornwall? So we either kind of cozy up to the Americans or the Europeans, but we can't just be left on our own here if there's going to be other alliances kind of formed. But there was some really great words there. It was like a competition, strategy, alliance. I mean, you can't have all those words in a sentence, but they've decided to track that. So I'm quite sure it is.
Global bodies are very good at having lots of words and sentences.
Yes, it seems to be like a strategic near adjacency or something. And so I'll wait to see kind of more what it is. I mean, we know, like, from history how good we are at sharing even the most trivial things on the internet with you know, other nations, like the safe harbor requirements or cookie laws or GDPR, and we've always kind of hit a wall and then trying to work around some provisions when it comes to those things when it's European and US. Or maybe there'll be the European, US, and the UK in the middle as the geographical
That's very
midpoint.
optimistic, but great. Adrian, do we have a seat at the table still?
So I just start with the fact that, post the B word, it doesn't kind of free you up in some sense to be whatever you want and do whatever you want. Because if there are EU directives on certification of algorithms, that's going to be an international kind of thing, and you won't be able to play, you won't be able to sell. So you really have to be in that space. I would amplify Andy's point. Here is where you try to use agencies, perhaps outside government, because they're locked into a particular ideological set of words and rhetoric and the rest. And you use agencies like the Royal Society to keep in touch with the National Academy of Sciences in the States and the academies within Europe. And sort of through the back door, stay in the room, even though you haven't been invited.
So a big role for Turing and the Royal Society, which is convenient for you.
Indeed. And that's why you need these kind of independent agencies actually that don't take orders from government.
But do you worry that we are going to fall behind? The opportunity to actually have our own regulatory space is actually quite small.
It may depend on different arenas. I think in the data area, we might already have a sort of leadership position. But if you're going to certify algorithms, we're one player among many.
I'm going to bring it back to domestic politics and the UK and Dominic Cummings. Obviously, we all know that he's been a great sort of fan of the use of data across government and has been the driving force behind some of the sort of COVID initiatives and integration of data sets to enable better decision making in government. In his absence, is there anyone in government driving this agenda, and do you worry about that? I mean, Andy, you obviously sort of have a frontline seat in terms of sort of government partnerships and the work the public does.
Yeah, so about a year ago, we bought a health tech business, UK business, one of the 4 businesses that can hold your medical records, your GP records, that is legally allowed to, because there's a huge government framework that is incredibly intensive in terms of what you have to do to be able to hold a medical record. And so we've done an awful lot of work in the last year or two with the healthcare sector in the UK. One of the great things, I'm going to choose a different word, one of the positive things of the kind of COVID crisis was the relaxation of data sharing agreements within healthcare. If you go to a hospital and you've been in an accident and you're unconscious, how did they get your medical records? There's no real data sharing between your GPs who think they own the record because it's their opinion of your health and someone who's trying to save your life in casualty. Now, the fact that those two things aren't talk to each other deliberately is kind of incredible. And one of the things that happened within COVID is when you get your vaccination, they can look up your details of who you are. It's your name, your address, your ethnicity, gender, and things of that nature. It's all held in a national system or small database. And there's an API to this, and you can now call it. You can now call it because before COVID, you couldn't, unless you were one of those 4 companies that has a license to hold information. And if other providers out of those 4 wanted your data, it had to be done on a GP practice basis.
But now, do you think that those gains of COVID are about to be lost in terms of the energy within government to keep up this agenda?
I don't usually plead with government, but I will on this instance. Please do not go back to the incredibly commercially siloed way of sharing healthcare data. If you can get through all the NHS digital accreditation, you can prove you're not doing anything evil, that it's got good clinical efficacy, this is going to save lives, you should be allowed to see the data of the patients you want to treat. It's very simple. So let's not repeal those things. The data sharing agreements that are temporary and in place due to the crisis should be made policy going forward, because they're a huge step forward.
Rachel, do you agree with that? And do you have a sort of view on who's driving the agenda that you care about in government?
There's a lot there. So I'm going to focus in, and I would say I would rather that there was an infrastructure strategy and there is an infrastructure lead rather than a kind of relentless focus on innovating and doing things differently. Because the reality is that particularly at national scale, the job of joining things up, understanding how things relate and connect, understanding what happens when even the jobs move in the country, what is needed in terms of connectivity, just like making it happen, right? And I think that what we're really lacking is a steady hand, and that the constant idea that we could be faster, quicker, better, and like I don't know anything about cars here, but bear with me, it's kind of like trying to make a Porsche when you, I don't know, have like some kind of old the banger, right? And what you're doing is you're not thinking about the engine, you're thinking about the paintwork. So and then I think there has not been anybody in government thinking at that level of joined up the departmental infrastructure, maybe ever.
Adrian, the same question to you about the Dominic Cummings, friend or foe of the data agenda, and what happens to him now that he's gone.
Certainly, both his agenda and what's happened with COVID has brought to the fore fundamental importance, potential importance of data, and a whole set of issues around that: ownership, availability, privacy, etc., etc. But there's still elementary technological things that get in the way. So within Turing, we were trying to do a particular project in looking after COVID patients, which required electronic patient records. The vast majority of NHS trusts in this country do not have electronic patient records. It's on pieces of paper. So there are elementary the digital has to come before the data in a certain kind of sense. So that I think there's still enormous work to be done. But I think within government, the Digital Economy Act some time ago gave the Office for National Statistics the power to access and link government administrative data, which unlinked is pretty useless in many connections. Clearly, all sorts of privacy and encryption and issues in and around that. But it has enabled the ONS, who now have a pivotal position in that space. So there are absolutely things that came out of that kind of drive going forward.
So the ONS is the new Dominic Cummings.
It's ownership of the, in some sense, the driver of that agenda. But the ONS, of course, has over time, as a custodian of national data, have been incredibly sensitive about ethical and privacy and other issues. It's almost the leading kind of techie expert in that space. So that is all good news, I think.
Great. Do we have any questions in the room? Question in the front row.
Years ago, I worked on a company called Value Added Medical Products. We invested in this company and created databases by providing computers to doctors to put their data on a no-name basis, building up to about 10 million patients. We then used that database for post-surveillance of drugs. So when under the FDA criteria, you have to have your drug tested after a year. So in other words, you have to know what that is.
Sorry, can we get to the question quickly?
No, I'll stop you.
No, if there was a question.
I was giving you some information.
Great.
Oh.
Andy,
Maybe you and I can have another conversation. And I don't have to talk.
Andy, do you have a view of sort of the value of those kind of data sets?
So there is a current initiative by NHS Digital to collect the medical records of people in the UK. A kind of second pass at the care.data initiative from a few years ago. It's a fantastic opportunity for the UK to show how to ethically, openly, and usefully engage with the public to say, we realize this data is your data. We realize there's the difference between who owns the data, who the data is about, and who's the custodian. And we want to have an open conversation, at a national level about how we'd like to use that data to predict new pandemics, to do the usefulness of drugs and their effects within society, or population level health. But they have to do that in a way that engenders trust by saying, this is actually what's going to happen with that data. This is how it's going to be owned and stored. These are your rights. Because at the moment, no one thinks that your medical record is yours, because it's about you, but you didn't write it. A GP wrote it. It's their opinions. That's why GPs think that this medical record is theirs, because it's their words. And there's a very good risk-based reason why they feel that way. But at the end of the day, you can't engage with the population in that and say, actually, your medical record's not yours. You have to say to the population, it's about you, it's your data, these are the protections we're going to put in place.
I've got a few questions on this wonderful device. I'm going to direct this one to Adrian, which is, could the UK national AI strategy not be focused on enabling and facilitating international AI strategy and collaboration?
In some areas, it's absolutely vital that it does that. If you look at the net zero agenda and climate change, that has to be done on a global data sharing basis. If you look at preparedness for future pandemics, we need mechanisms for data sharing across countries. So we don't even have to get into the abstract question. The immediacy of those issues needs to be tackled.
A question for you, Rachel, and then we're going to have to stop in a moment. We've implied on the panel that AI literacy for the public is of low value, was at low value. Agreed that the government needs to focus, but can we increase effective public participation without increasing that level of understanding?
So I think at the moment, right, there's no incentive for most people to engage with another kind of abstract thing, right? And that actually, I think what we really need is not education, but we need governance, and we need practical things that people can take part in. So it's like, you don't need to know how the energy comes into your house to know that there's a problem if it stops, right? We're not asking everyone to kind of train and have that kind of competency. And I think the thing I worry about is we can't push everything onto individuals. The very act of collecting data at a scale and processing it creates a power imbalance, which then we're being asked to respond to as individuals. And that actually there need to be collective mechanisms that all of us can take part in. And through that, there are opportunities for people to become more aware and educated. But I think that has to come first.
Now I have a final bit of action, which Tabitha has set me up for, which is to ask Adrian about the AI panels and its survey, to your point about collective responses.
Not
and people
unrelated
engaging.
to Rachel's last point.
Yeah.
We are, Turing is running on behalf really of the AI Council, a survey, and the usefulness of the survey is directly linked to how many people respond, in a sense. So here is an opportunity, if we can flag to everybody, get involved in that survey, and we'll get as broad a range of opinion as possible. It might not be the ideal or the ultimate weapon for tapping into the public sense, but I think it's a first step to try and get engaged.
So I'm not going to try and sum up the panel, but I was taken by the point about whether the UK is basically the equivalent of an old banger rather than a Porsche, that we should be a bit nicer to Europe possibly after Brexit, that the ONS is the new Dominic Cummings, and that we should all pay attention to Adrian and the Royal Society and the Turing Institute, who are going to be people to watch behind the scenes. And to Rachel's point about engagement with communities, that we need to pay attention to that. And it doesn't matter about necessarily leading, but being part of it is actually as effective as for the strategy. So with that, can you join me in thanking our panel?
Thank you. That's great.